My name is Navina Naqvi. I am Assistant Professor of Persianate Islamic Cultures of South Asia at the University of British Columbia. I am speaking to you in my capacity as a co-host, along with my colleagues, Dr. Mustafa Abidini Fard and Dr. Alexandra Hoffman. The three of us are co-hosts of the Alireza Ahmadian Lecture series, the lectures in Iranian and Persianate Studies, hosted by the Department of Asian Studies. The Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia is located at UBC's Vancouver campus, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I urge you to reflect on what it means to gather virtually on land that has been underwritten by a long and living history of colonialism. Before I introduce our talk and our speakers today, I want to say a few words about the Alireza Ahmadian Lectures in Iranian and Persianate Studies. Alireza Ahmadian, who was born in 1981 and passed away in 2019, was an enthusiastic researcher, a consummate sociopolitical analyst, and an opinion leader on foreign policy who nurtured the virtues of diplomatic dialogue and liberal democracy. Alireza was a proud and devoted UBC alumnus, a supporter of UBC's Department of Asian Studies, and a beloved member of the Canadian-Iranian community. The department renamed this lecture series in his honor in 2019. I'd like to now introduce the talk. It is titled, as you can see, Debating Islam at the Court of the Great Mughal. And our speaker today is Dr. Usman Hamid, and our discussant is Dr. Sajjad Nejatieh. I'd also like to thank, before I introduce Dr. Hamid and Dr. Nejatieh, I'd like to thank Lisa Matsumoto, Tiffany Ip, and Razman Gudarzi for all their wonderful behind-the-scenes help. Okay, so today's speaker, Dr. Usman Hamid, is a historian of Islam. He's based in Northwestern University and is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies. He's a historian of Islam in early modern South Asia and focuses on the connections across the Persianate and Indian Ocean worlds. His research explores the devotional and cultural histories of Muslim communities, focusing on the discursive and material expressions of their lived experiences. His current book project examines the role of early modern travel between North India and the Hijaz on Muslim discourse. My mistake. He works on early modern travel between North India and the Hijaz, on Muslim discourses and practices of devotion, focusing on the Prophet Muhammad. By examining the histories of the Prophet's textual and material traces, his work shows how the circulation of books, people, and objects gave rise to new and at times overlapping religious sensibilities and subjectivities. Usman received his PhD from the University of Toronto and taught at Hamilton College before joining Northwestern University. He has published on relics of the Prophet Muhammad, gender and politics in late 15th century Iran and Central Asia, and early modern circulations between South Asia and Iran. Our discussant today also got his PhD at the University of Toronto, and it is Dr. Sajjad Nejatieh, who is assistant professor in the Department of History and Sociology at the University of British Columbia in Okanagan. Dr. Nejatieh's current research focuses on processes of empire and state building in the early modern Persianate world, how the activities and ideologies of polities in this region are commemorated in the historiography, and the ways in which pre-modern histories are reimagined and represented in modern nationalist discourses. I will now invite Dr. Hamid to begin his talk.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the lovely invitation. It's a real privilege to sort of be presenting as part of this series, and thank you to everyone who was sort of involved in organizing this, and of course, thank you to Sajjad. I'd love to re-meet digitally for agreeing to be the respondent. I'm just going to do my last check to make sure that the slide and all are visible, um, and then I'm ready to uh, I'll begin. So I'll actually begin with a bit of a story, if you don't mind. And I hope you can see the map visible to you. If the slides don't move, just let me know. So I want to begin this talk with a little bit of a story. And the story comes from 1580 at the Mughal court of the Emperor Akbar. The Mughal polity was one that sort of more or less sort of these were the expanse of the empire. It went a little bit further south during this late 17th century. Um, but this is sort of like the large domain of the Mughal Empire, especially by the beginning of by the 17th century. Um, and the story begins in the city of the imperial capital of Fatehpur Sikri that you can see north next to the Indo-Gangetic Plain, next to the rivers. And in February 1580, at the Mughal court of the Emperor Akbar, there was a spectacular royal procession that was held to welcome to this imperial capital a very remarkable object. This object began its journey across the Indian Ocean, which you can sort of see over here, and began its story in the city of Mecca, over here that you can just sort of see at the leftmost edge of the map. This object in question was a stone, and the stone bore an impression of a foot that was purportedly that of the Prophet Muhammad. The relic was brought by a Gujarati Sayyid by the name of Abu Turab, who had been appointed the Amir-e-Hajj by the Mughal Emperor 3 years earlier. And I just want to sort of point out that this our Sayyid over here, this figure, was from Ahmedabad, which is on the southwest coast of India. So you can sort of see over here uh, next to the this is where Gujarat and Ahmedabad are. So the arrival of the footprint relic was met with considerable pomp and ceremony. Those present that day recorded in detail the displays of veneration and piety that was sort of on display. We know that the relic was first placed outside the city of Fatehpur Sikri, and there it was actually housed in these royal tents. This royal tent that you're sort of seeing here gives you an impression of what they may have looked like. Of course, this is from the late 17th to early 18th century. But you can sort of see this sort of iconically red royal tents were sent out by the Mughal emperor to house the relic, and then that's where the procession first went out. The activities began outside the city, where the relic was housed in royal tents. Akbar and his court set out before daybreak and offered the morning prayer or the Fajr namaz in the presence of the relic. We are told that Akbar went and kissed the relic, after which many members of court, according to the station, went up and greeted the relic. And finally, the soldiers performed circumambulations around the relic, tawaf, like one would do in Hajj, or some shrines. And then the relic was first brought to Fatehpur Sikri. And what's interesting is the relic was first carried by the Emperor Akbar in his own sort of cloak. Then it got passed on to another person, then to another one. And so you can imagine that here's an aerial view of Fatehpur Sikri. And so, you have to imagine this sort of in a very long procession with many members of the royal court involved, highly public kind of demonstration of piety, but also courtly fanfare, right? Um, the relic was brought into the city where it was brought to the harem first. There, the women of the royal family, got the opportunity to sort of perform a ziyarat, so to say. That's how it's called in our sources. And then it was finally conveyed to a building that was near the congregational mosque or the Jami Masjid of the royal capital. And Akbar basically instituted a policy that those who are going to perform the Friday prayer, the Jummah prayer, after the performance, they were to go and perform tawaf or circumambulations around this relic afterwards. Now, fascinatingly, recalling the episodes many years later, Akbar's court historian Abul Fazl, who's also maybe thought of as a propagandist for the Mughal royal court, included a remarkable assessment of the royal proceedings. He wrote that while the emperor carried out the royal procession and showered the object with great deference, he did so being fully aware that it was baseless, na asli, like had lacking in foundation. And not only that, but that acute experts had demonstrated that it was worthless, right? Instead, Abu Fazl says that the emperor has staged this whole procession so that people don't make fun of the Sayyid who has brought the relic. Okay. As he says, so that the reverence that is due to the simple-minded Sayyid, quite harsh, may not be spilled onto the ground, and that critics may not burst into smiles. He's kind of on the one hand presenting the Sayyids for being quite simple-minded for actually bringing this relic, but also arguing that Akbar only sort of showed this reverence because he didn't want this guy to be embarrassed. Okay. Now, there are two things that are quite remarkable about Abu Fazl saying this, right? First is that you're like, okay, what was this religious investigation, right? What inquiry took place? What was the questions that were asked? What evidence was perhaps brought out? How did they figure out that the thing was na asli, and who was involved as well, right? And unfortunately, this is not found in the chronicles, but we have a news source, not news source, but a newly printed source uh, that sort of helps us give us some answer. The other question, of course, is also raises is why would Akbar perform such a massive public procession that involved so much, so the involvement of so many cast of characters, soldiers, nobility, the royal household, if he was only doing it to sort of not embarrass someone, right? And this person who he was not supposedly not embarrassing, although was notable, he wasn't somebody who was like super pivotal to the empire, right? This is not a royal prince. This is not a major like Khan who's got like many soldiers. This is somebody who's mostly been a bureaucrat, like, kind of life, right? He later becomes Amin, so that's a kind of like not a um, not a military position, right? Okay. Um, so for the purposes of this talk, I won't go into the second question, but I'm happy to sort of answer about it. But I want to talk about, okay, what do we know about these religious debates? Now, the minute you mention religious debates in the context of the Mughal Empire, you have the what comes to the mind of many people is the idea of the Ibadat Khana, sometimes referred to as the house of worship or the house of devotion. And this was a site at the imperial capital where religious debates between ulama of various traditions and then later on members of other religious traditions are said to have taken place. By the time the relic comes or the qadam comes to the royal court, the Abbas Khana at that point also includes not only Sunnis and Shias, but Brahmins, Jains, Jews, Jesuits, and Zoroastrians who are sort of involved in these kinds of debates. Now, of course, these debates are have received a lot of attention in Mughal historiography, and there's been some really important sort of interventions about it. One of the things that people have also pointed out is that the debates or religious conversations across traditions were not just limited to this Ibadat Khana, right? So there was, of course, patronage taking place at many imperial to sub-imperial levels. It took place after Akbar's life as well. And so this is not sort of like the end-all be-all of Mughal interreligious conversations or debates about religion. But the Ibadat Khana, in a way, was this performative space for the Mughal emperor to enact his authority, right? So the Mughal emperor presented himself as a figure who stood above the bounds of any one religious legal tradition or sort of normative tradition, but rather saw himself as somebody who was overseeing um, was sort of standing one layer above people of many religious traditions, and it was the prerogative of the sovereign to sort of make the final decision, to make the final interpretive decision on questions of religion, right? And so it's in this context that we know that this relic arrives. So I'm sort of really interested in this, not just because this question of the relic, but also what is interesting is that we don't actually have many textual accounts of the debates themselves. What we have a lot are accounts that were written in chronicles describing some of the contents of these debates, but we don't have many texts, at least for the Ibadat Khana. Now we have a text from the early 17th century that sort of gives you a transcript of sorts. I will transcript in quotes, right? Like nothing is an accurate transcript. But we don't actually have many textual accounts of what was actually the foundations of the debates, like what evidence was being brought, how was it being debated. We sort of know some of the topics, the cast of characters. And so this arrival of this relic is actually also a productive way of thinking about, like, okay, what were the terms of debate, right? How are truth claims made in this context? So, what are our sources for this topic, right? Luckily, we have two important ones. The first one is this chronicle or a history, shall we say? It's called Tariq-e-Gujarat. And this was actually written by our fellow who brought the relic, right? This is Abu Turab, the Gujarati Sayyid I was mentioning earlier. And I should say this is interesting. His family is originally from Shiraz, right? So they're like three, four generations away from, and they sort of arrive in Gujarat during the reign of Shah Ismail. But that's what the story goes. Anyways, so he writes this history, Tariq-e-Gujarat. So this manuscript that you're seeing here is from the British Library and it's copied in the 18th century. But he wrote this in the late 16th century, right? He dies at the end of the 16th century, but we don't know exactly which date he dies. And this text is an interesting text because it's probably produced at the time in Akbar's reign when he was asking people who were involved in imperial service to write down accounts of the Mughal family's history so they could produce something like the Akbarnama, right? So this text is clearly produced with an audience of the Mughal court to incorporate sort of his narrative into the official histories, right? So it's like a very purposeful text. And so it sort of will posit his arrival of the relic in a framework that makes sense for the Mughal Empire. The other text, which is really helpful for this moment, is a text that was published. I guess now it's been a while, time flies. But it was published by Rasul Jafrian, and it is a text called the Risale-i Kadamiya, the treatise of the foot, or rather the treatise of the footprint relic, shall we say, right? The Kadam is, of course, the stone relic that was brought. And so this was written by Akbar's poet laureate and Abul Fazl's brother, Faizi. And so that's also an interesting thing. And Faizi sort of writes, it's a short treatise, and it's a text that is essentially authorized by the Mughal court to describe the arrival of the relic, the debate that takes place, and the argumentations that were made to venerate the relic, right? So in unlike many of our other Ibadat Khana or like sort of religious faiths, this is not a second-hand account that is sort of recounting it, or I mean, in a way, of course, it is a second-hand account recounting it, but at least it is giving us a sense of what is the logic or thinking process of the court when they were debating this question of religion, right? They were debating whether this was asli, non-asli. Um, this What is notable about this text is that, of course, it was written by Faizi, an important sort of Mughal poet, but Faizi was also something more than that. In a way, he was the stylist or the literary stylist that gave Mughal texts, Mughal court texts, a kind of literary sheen. So he was involved in kind of rewriting or sort of basically sprucing up and making ornamenting these texts that were being written by for the Mughal court, and some of these were quite public. So some of them were like something like a decree, something like a khutbah or sermon, and then of course Mughal court histories, translation projects. And Faizi's job, in many ways, was to go through the text after other people had worked on it, and then sort of make it much more high literary, right? So Faizi may actually have been his involvement in writing this text may have been at the next level, and there may have been multiple people involved, but the authorship of the text on in both manuscripts and later accounts Faizi. So in a way, we can see this as the Mughal court's take on this relic. Okay. Now, let me go back to our story for a second and let's dive into what happens, right? So, news of the relic's arrival reached the Mughal court soon after Abu Turab returned to Gujarat, right? So, he comes back to Gujarat after performing Hajj and he sends off a letter to the Mughal court to say that, hey, we've got this Qadam, it's coming, right? And it's full of good fortune. And so then he's like, okay, I'm gonna come to Fatehpur Sikri, the capital, and bring it along. Even before he sort of reaches it, there's a firman that comes to him, and it comes from the Mughal emperor, and the Mughal emperor says that he would like to honor and exalt the relic, right? And perform the rituals of istiqbal or welcome. Um, but then Akbar sort of says, tells Abu Turab to basically place it, 15 to 20 kilometers away from the city, and this is where those tents, the royal tents, go out. And to keep the relic at a sort of like a clean, pure place. But first, you should come to the court because we have to sort of ascertain the veracity of its situation, right? So its ehval, its sort of conditions have to be, um, we have to verify them. And the word that's used over here is tehqiq onam, right? Tehqiq is a very interesting and loaded term. Recent scholarship has sort of shown that tehqiq was a process of investigation that seems to, or also an idea about a kind of investigation into religious truth claims in the Mughal Empire, in the Timurid period, and also in the Ottoman period. Um, and so that's kind of like been an interesting term that the word tahqiq has been used really as a way of sort of how do you authenticate uh, questions of religious truth. And it's often juxtaposed against taqlid, which is sort of to follow, right? So rather than following a tradition, you're sort of like practicing tahqiq. Now, the way in which scholars have also thought about this idea of tehqiq in the Mughal context is that tehqiq was a process that facilitated a certain kind of universal peace, right? Sulh Kul. And debates at the Ibadat Khana where such tehqiq took place was part of a royal prerogative and royal practice. Um, to sort of form ideal kind of uh, religious subjects, right? I form ideal uh, subjects. Now, with Tehreek, the problem is, well, not the problem, but where we are in the research on Tehreek at the Mughal Empire, is that we don't actually, again, we don't know how Tehreek took place. There's been some really wonderful scholarship done on Tehreek in the context of processes such as philology, Tehreek in the process of truth seeking, but we know how Tehreek operated in the context of, how dictionaries were put together or those things. But what were and how were sort of worked. But we know less about how debates about ritual, for instance, how did Tehreek operate in that context, right? And one of the questions is, one of the sort of themes that is sort of put forward is the concept of Tehreek um, is always juxtaposed against the creed. And part of that is to sort of uh, to s- the technique or this investigation goes above scriptural texts or scriptural sources, that there have to be some other kind of truth claim made and it can't be based on scripture. And I would argue, and I'm going to show that I don't that this is a little bit of an assumption that we make because we don't actually have the text or we don't actually have records of actually how the debate took place or what elements of the debate took place. And so, in fact, actually, scriptural sources are pretty important in that respect. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about our two accounts of this tehqiq, right? We have one account of the tehqiq that took place with Abu Turab's account and one account that took place with Faizi's account. And they sort of reflect two, I would argue, two different perhaps stages in the investigative process, right? So the first one is with Abu Turab and in his account. So uh, when this relic is brought, what is said about it is that this is a hamdast or a companion of another Qadam that had come to South Asia already. And this Qadam is at the Dargah Qadam Sharif or the Shrine of the Noble Footprint in Delhi. This relic arrives in the 1400s, or 14th century, sorry, um, and is eventually sort of is enshrined at a particular site, and that site eventually becomes a dargah. And here's like a 19th century painting of that dargah. Um, so according to Abu Tarab, this is what the investigation goes down. So he writes that he had the privilege of having the honor of kissing the royal carpet, and then from him it was simply asked whether the qadam was the impression of the left foot or the right foot. And Abu Turab's like, it's of the right foot. And Akbar said, okay, if it's of the right foot, then it's authentic because the qadam that we have in Delhi is represents the left foot, right? So the idea is that these two, there's one moment where the Prophet stood on stone, and so they were the impression of its left foot, right foot. So the left foot came earlier, and the right foot is now brought in the 16th century. And that is and so then he says the authentication was positive tehqiq rastas, right? So like the tehqiq was like correct, gave a correct answer or gave a correct answer or sort of authenticated it. Okay. And then according to Abu Tarab, that's enough for Akbar, and he says, okay, let's prepare the celebration, the festivities to do it, right? To honor it. Okay. Now, the Risale Academia gives a much larger account of the logic and thought process that went into it. So while Abu Turab's account sort of lacks details beyond asking about whether it's the left foot or the right foot, the Risala Academia gives much more insight. I'm going to read out a quotation that Faizi writes about it. And I think it's important. So he says, in the book of authentic traditions, so here he's referring to the sixth Sahih, it is mentioned that there are many miracles of His Excellency, the Prophet Muhammad, right? Peace be upon him and such. And that they are more numerous than they can be counted, right? And so many of which have been sort of enumerated by keepers of tradition, Akbar, and people, and then extractors of Asar, um, and they adorn many books of the Prophet Sira and of different Hadith collections. And then he sort of gives names of a series of really important sort of books, including Sheikh Ibn Kathir. But then he says, okay, none of these books have reached India. That's a really interesting claim. We can sort of expand on that a little bit and what that actually means. And he says that in the biographies and the muntakhab or the abridgments that have come to India, no word of whether this miracle of the Prophet sort of creating this stone relic can be found, right? Um, and so he writes that given this, it is necessary to be cautious, to practice caution, ihtiyat, about any conjecture that will either deny this miracle or and basically also to avoid criticism, right? Now, one of the interesting things is that the first layer of they're trying to authenticate are Sunni Hadith, right? Like finding Sunni Hadith. And they're basically saying, well, we don't have access to them, right? And I would sort of say that maybe Faizi's comment about all of India not having them is a little bit perhaps hyperbole, but it probably certainly means that the Mughal court of Fatehpur Sikri perhaps did not have in its library as many volumes on Hadith at this point. We know that, of course, Hadith study picks up in after Akbar's reign, right, in the 1600s, particularly with people like Abdul Haq Dehlavi traveling from Delhi to the Hijaz and back. So it's possible that there was actually like a paucity of books. One of the things that keeps coming up in reading these accounts is not for the emperor, but how hard it is for scholars to actually buy a book, acquire a book, pay for the book. They're all in debt, trying to sort of like purchase a book they don't have, and then of course they're trying to copy it and then make some money by selling those copies. Anyways, so I'll go back to the thing. So first, Hadith are you the first truth claim belongs to Hadith, right? But he says they aren't there. And then Faizi tells us why then Akbar venerates relic. And this is about the ihtiyat. So he says, although the truth of its soundness has not reached from books of authentic traditions, it is nevertheless fitting on account of good conduct, husn adab, to strive on the path of caution by fully honoring it and bringing forth practices that ennoble it, right? Because if it is the impression of the prophet, then the obligation of exalting it have been met. And if it's not done so, then the veneration that has been done on good intentions or niyat will be its own reward, right? Now, of course, spanning out a little bit, you know, I think that there is also a political reason why Akbar has venerates the relic, right? This is also the moment that he's under criticism, right, from many members of uh, sort of people who are not sort of down with the way in which the dispensation seems to be sort of like operating in the realm of the emperor's appropriation of all religious authority and also all political authority, right? And even in this conversation, uh, Abu Fazl later on sort of says, that like there was much criticism and his veneration of this relic dashed their sort of um, smiles. Now, what is also interesting about this is what are the other forms of authentication that or that it reached for? One of them is actually the text's introduction. So the text begins with a series of Arabic benedictions or praise. And so what's interesting is, of course, almost all Persian texts that were sort of treatises or writings, they often begin with some praise of God and then the Prophet Muhammad, right? These are conventions by Muslim authors. Um, and so the way in which Faizi makes an argument is that he starts by praising the God's divine attributes. And the way he sort of explicate what the divine attribute is using Quranic surah. And his choice of Quranic surahs are very notable because all of them incorporate a word that has the ka, the, ma root, right? So none of these verses are actually talking about a qadam, right? But you have to imagine for an audience that is who- most audiences who may have had a smattering of Arabic, um, for them, the oral element of hearing a attribute of God and then a Quranic verse which has kadama, makdam, or whatever word that comes up, there's a sonic power of a Quranic verse that is sort of sanctifying this object. Okay, so that's the praise of God. Then how does he praise the prophet? Again, the prophet's attributes, and then he quotes hadith. And what do all those hadith have in common? Again, ka, the, ma. It has a word with that root. So what that means is that we actually think about this text, and we know this text circulated to sites where the relic was eventually kept, is that if that is read out loud to you, right, what you are hearing are names of God and then later names of the Prophet or attributes. Then you're hearing a Quranic verse, and in the context of the Prophet, you're hearing a hadith. And each of them seems to refer to a qadam, right? So here what we're seeing is that actually scriptural texts are very important, here that it is a rhetorical or oral power, right? It is a so when we also just thinking about when we're talking about scripturalism, I think we need a more sophisticated language, right? We need to be thinking about, are we talking about, are they looking at the seers, or are they looking at scripture or looking at hadith and looking at the Quran for its oral power and the truth claiming that is done by that by sound. So first that. Then what is the second support? So after giving Akbar's logic, the way in which the final authorization takes place is by listing all the ulama of Mecca and Medina who have authorized the veneration of relics, right? And so here is an interesting thing, that this is a text. This is that the way in which this technique takes place is that it does not it that it privileges texts like the Quran, Hadith. It privileges their like full capacity, right? And it privileges the authority of the ulama. Of course, it is Akbar who is like the main decider. So then, when we also think about Tehreek writ large, I think we need to make sure we don't fall into the trap of thinking of Tehreek as some sort of like reasoning that does not seem that like when you read in the secondary scholarship, Tehreek in the context of it almost reads like there is a disavowal of tradition, or there is a kind of interrogation of the two things of tradition. But rather, what we're seeing here is that the tradition, that there's recourse to the tradition in the Heek, right? And sometimes there are limits that they don't have access to the necessarily material texts or the actual books that will sort of give them access to it. But there's still some sort of rhetorical sort of power claim being made through them. So that's kind of like the debating Islam part of it. I just want to sort of conclude on what happens to the relic afterwards. So, it's kept at the Mughal court, but lo and behold, Abu Turab is like goes up to Akbar and is like, "Hey, okay, speak colloquially. But he basically tells him that, you already have a relic in Hindustan, right? And it's through the power of these relics that your mamlakat, your like empire, your power, your domains extend. But given that you have conquered Gujarat uh, only 2 decades ago, and the conquest of Gujarat is kind of like, there's rebellions involved. There's a lot of sort of like interplay happening, and this rebellion that takes place soon after Abu Turab goes back. He said, why don't you send the Kadam to Ahmedabad and and that will fortify your power there. And Akbar sort of says, sure, and he basically gives money and sort of assigns villages to the construction of a kadamgah or mazar, a shrine or place of visitation. And you can see over here in this image what this kadamgah looks like. And what's really interesting about this kadamgah that you can see is if you look at the layout, it is not a place which you perform ritual prayer, but a place that you go and perform tawaf or circumambulation. You go around the central place where the relic was kept. So there's also a continuity of rituals from when the court sort of welcomed the relic. And we know that sort of Faizi's Risala was sort of kept here or sort of would be brought out. And the people who had sort of would come to the relic, visit the relic, would have some kind of at least oral access to it, because you have a visitor's account from the 18th century that tell us sort of like a Sheikh Faizi said this, and then he includes a little poem that Faizi sort of may have included. Another one of the ways of his making argumentations for the authenticity of the relic is through poetry. And I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more about that if anyone has questions. So that's sort of the story of the Qadam. Um, and I think it's an interesting case study to think about how did questions of religion here it's not of religious encounter, but of in the context of Islam. How were they actually thought of? How were they actually debated or authenticated? And what resources we use to make truth claims? Thank you so much, and thank you for sitting through this presentation. I will stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamid. That was wonderful. I would now like to invite Dr. Nijatieh to engage with Dr. Hamid in a conversation about the talk, and then we'll move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Naqvi, for the kind introduction. And I also wanted to give quick thanks to Ms. Matsumoto, as well as the staff and faculty at the Department of Asian Studies for helping with organizing this great event. And of course, thank you to Dr. Hamid for his wonderful talk on the religious policies of Akbar. Dr. Hamid, I think you did a wonderful job, contributing to our knowledge of this subject by contextualizing this fascinating episode involving Akbar's very public display of devotion to this relic of the Prophet Muhammad's footprint. The empiricist in me particularly appreciated learning about these debates. You mentioned tahqiq, the research that went into seeing the validity of this relic. And I was also particularly intrigued about the perspective of Akbar's court historian, Abul Fazl, who was sort of unambiguously skeptical about the veracity of the relic. And you mentioned a few times he referred to it as baseless or na asli. And it would appear, and I think you would agree, that Akbar was at least aware of the possibility that this procession involving the relic was na asl. Nevertheless, he seems to have been trying to, at the same time, tap into this sort of broader social world wherein acts of devotion to relics of this type was quite commonplace, certainly among the Sufis of India, but also among the non-Muslim religious communities of South Asia, right? I think the Hindus and the Buddhists had very similar traditions. So this was a rich and fascinating analysis. It raised quite a few questions in my mind, and hopefully also among our audience members. I do see that there was a few questions in the chat, which we'll also try to address in turn. But to start off, I thought we would discuss a little bit some questions that, or at least one question that I had in mind. I was curious to get your thoughts on sort of the historical implications of Akbar's religious attitude. As you know, by the 18th century, there was an increasing emphasis among the Sufis of North India, at least Hindustan, including those affiliated with Sufi silsilas like the Naqshbandi, on the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet, and the Hadith of the Prophet. And I was curious to get your insights. To what extent do you think this shift, maybe not a complete shift, but a partial shift away from reliquary Sufism and towards this more scriptural or textual form of piety that focused more on things like the Hadith, the Quran, studying with learned scholars in the Hijaz. Was this related or perhaps even a reaction to Akbar's religious attitudes and policies? And I realize I might be looking a little bit ahead with this question into the post-Akbarian period, but I thought it would be particularly relevant to your talk because Akbar, as you know, is often juxtaposed to some of the later rulers of the Mughal Empire. And I'm thinking especially figures like Aurangzeb, who's considered the more orthodox and more pious ruler compared to Akbar, who's usually viewed as sort of non-traditional, even heterodox in some of his beliefs. So maybe to put it another way, do you think, do you see a direct or even an indirect connection between Akbar's lack of orthodoxy, unorthodoxy, and the more orthodox later Mughal rulers like Aurangzeb?
So I'm going to give a little bit of a longer answer to this. But I'll try to avoid the word orthodox. I can go into that a little bit later. But what I think, what you mentioned about the Sunnah, is sort of what I think is that key here, right? At the 17th century. So one of the things that we see in the 17th century is that you start to have from the late 16th century. So basically, after Mughals conquered Gujarat, it is much easier for North Indians to go to Gujarat and then go on to perform Hajj. And of course, this Sindh has a very slightly different history with this context because they they didn't have to connect to Gujarat, right? They could just be from Sindh. But at least the ones in the sort of Indo-Gangetic plain, so places like Sirhind, Delhi, so on and so forth, um, they sort of benefit from the Mughal appropriation and sort of incorporation of the Sultanate of Gujarat's maritime networks into that. So you start having people like Abdul Haq Dehlavi, who was an important sort of 17th century muhaddith, and also numerous members of the Naqshbandi. So, like for instance, Sheikh Ahmed Hindi's two of his sons go for Hajj. Shah Waliullah later goes for Hajj. So you start having these figures who are going. Now, the next part is when we're talking about Hadith, what is it that we're actually referring to? Right? Are we talking about those multi-volume collections of Sahih Bukhari? Are we talking about multi-volume collections of commentaries like Fateh Bari? Are we talking about sort of these arba'ins that are just, 40 thin collections? So what happens is that what in the late Mamluk period, so we're just kind of shifting so Egypt and Hijaz become this center of, let's say, new Hadith study, right? Joe Blecher sort of worked on this, and there's a number of scholars who've sort of worked on this region. But there's a new, let's say, canon of texts, commentaries, collections, recompilations. So Hadith can be categorized either by the transmitters or so the topic or what have you. And so there's a lot of work happening there. Figures like Abdul Haq Dehlavi are involved in going to study those, copying those texts and bringing them back to India and then circulating them and teaching them. So we see this actually happen in the Seerah of the Prophet. So one of the most popular seerahs of the Prophet in the Mughal period is a work that was written by a Timurid preacher from Herat. His grandson ends up in Lahore after the Safavids take over Herat. Um, but his Seerah of the Prophet, you cannot open a catalog of Persian manuscripts that were either collected from South Asia, so British Library and all that, or in South Asia that does not have copies of this manuscript. And we know these manuscripts are copied well into the 18th, 19th century. Those are also talking about the Prophet's life. They refer to hadith, but they're not referring to sources like those hadith compilations. They're referring to sources like Jami. They're referring to, so they'll use sort of like, for instance, they'll say hadith, right? But they won't say perhaps where it's from or whatever this thing. And they'll have a story by Jami or Rumi that sort of expands upon this, right? So you're seeing Sufi texts being part of how you understand the Prophet, right? And so figures like Abdul Haq Dehlavi, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ground the seerah of the Prophet, so Futuwat. The seerah of the Prophet is kind of like considered to be an important source for developing Futuwat or sort of Sufi self-fashioning. That rather than kind of those, hadith that you can't fully authenticate or stories about the Prophet that aren't that Hadith doesn't authenticate but are known from other texts. So they're reworking what are the ground material for understanding what the Sunnah is and therefore for becoming a good Sufi, right? So part of what is happening, I think, is that it is a very specific canon of Sunni Hadith in the 17th century that is being introduced into Mughal India, and then that then gets taught going further, right? And I think this is also relates to Faizi's comment where he says we don't have access to it because, in fact, that's part of why figures like Abdul Haq Dehlavi are off to the Hijaz to study rather than studying in India with great muhaddith, right? At least in the North India, Indo-Gangetic plain. So that's what I would say is happening in that context. I think there's larger historical processes like the circulation that allows people to go and then bring this knowledge and disseminate that. There is also no doubt that actually the Naqshbandis become quite are not appropriated into the structure of political power as they were in Herat, right? So in Herat, in Central Asia, in the Timrid and Uzbek context, or that kind of Timrid context, these Naqshbandi sheikhs are sort of major Waqf trustees, right? And so they're intermediaries between tax-paying urban and agricultural subjects and the emirs. And uh, the when they come to South Asia, they're not kind of able to replicate that, right? That kind of urban and agricultural work mediated kind of like sociocultural power. Um, that's what I would say that is so the Lakshmanis are also having that kind of experience. But I'll say one more thing. Okay, so the last thing I will say is, in fact, the Naqshbandis debate amongst themselves about the authenticity of relics. So Shah Waliullah, a major figure, he is fully believes in the barakat of the Prophet's hair. And we know that his family had the Prophet's hair. They would sort of bring it out once a year, twice a year for viewing, for people to come do ziyarat. Um, of course, we know that then there's the other Naqshbandi Sheikh like Shah Ismail, who's basically just like, you can't venerate na asli things. Another Naqshbandi author like Shah Abdul Aziz, it's asked of him in a fatwa, okay, like what about like the barakat or these relics. And he says, if we don't know their sort of veracity, if we don't know whether they're asli, not asli, we shouldn't venerate them, right? But the ones that are established, the thabit, we should, right? So I would say that the Naqshbandi tradition itself doesn't have a uniform attitude to it. But this question about whether they're asli or not asli definitely is there. And it seems by the 18th, 19th century, the attitude is that unlike Akbar, who's saying, no, we don't know, but then we should practice caution, we should venerate it. They're kind of like, well, if it's not asli, we shouldn't, right? So that's the shift I'm seeing with this particular thing. Um, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that
Great
question.
answer. No, that's a great
Yeah.
answer. And yeah, I think it just shows that some of these debates surrounding veracity, they continued, they survived Akbar into the 19th century. So great answer. And I'm sure I
Yeah.
could ask you many more, but I did also notice that there's a few questions in the question and answer, which I would love to
Yes.
get to because it looks like we have quite a few. So if you don't mind,
Perfect.
we'll
Yeah.
discuss some of these questions. We'll start
Sure.
off with Khayyam. Thank you so much
Yes.
for this question, Khayyam. The question is, could Akbar's Tawaf performance be seen as another way he legitimated himself as a king of his Indo-Persian Empire, along with
Yeah.
endorsing courtly interreligious debate and commissioning Persian Sanskrit exchange? I think he's thinking of the
Yeah.
translation movement that took place. Yeah.
Yes. So 100%, right? So one of the things that happens is that so I 100% agree that I think that there was a um, political exigencies also involved in this because this is a moment in his reign where what is happening is that there are actually other contenders, right, within his own family, like the broader extended Timurid family, whether that is cousins or whether it's his half brother, who are also competing for power, as well as the Uzbek Khans who have sort of who are in service of Humayun, but then I'm just like, who is this upstart, right? Because what Akbar is doing at this moment is that he is making much more vertical structures of political authority, unlike the more Timur context of like a more sort of diffuse structures of power, right? And so what happens is that around this time, there's also particular rebellions that break out, particularly on the eastern end of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. And there are, I believe, like particular preachers who are sort of giving it a kind of uh, public space and public critique, right? It's not just the emirs, but you have members of like sort of like ulama functionaries who are also sort of involved in this, right? So that's kind of spreading. And so Abu Fazl definitely says, like those who like doubted the Akbar sort of like veneration of the Prophet were sort of like, shown, basically like shown off, right? Um, and later historians in the 18th century, when they narrate this account, one of them is very much like, yeah, the only reason Akbar did this was because there was public criticism of him. And so he was trying to show that he was a good, like, Muslim monarch. So 100%, this is, I think, there is a real political reasoning for it, and I think so that may sort of like direct why Akbar practice caution, ihtiyat, and but it kind of also shows like in order to do that, what are the things that you have resource to, or you try to make resource to in that context? Yeah, thank you.
Um,
Answer.
I just wanted to say that we have some more time. I don't think you fully used your time. So if you feel like you have more that you want to ask Usman, I think we have a few more minutes for that before we
Sure.
get to the question.
Yeah. Why don't we do this? Siddharth, you can ask another question, then we can take go to the room, and then we can go back and forth if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll just
Yeah.
there was a question here by Tillo. I hope I'm
Mhm.
pronouncing that correctly. Who also says wonderful lecture, and they thanked you for that wonderful talk. And the question is the 1586 Ahmedabad Qadamgah was strongly resembles contemporaneous cenotaphs among Jain monks. There was a pavilion, a chhatri with footprints, paduka that's mentioned. Jain memorial pavilions were themselves developed under the influence of Persianate and from these Rajput memorials. But the
Mhm.
question is, did earlier Islamic footprint shrines from outside of India, if there were any,
Yeah.
already have the same architectural form? Or was this vice versa, a Jain influence on the Qadamgah? Or maybe
Yeah.
even Akbar's practice of venerating the footprint more broadly?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a really wonderful question. So one of the things that's interesting about the Kadamga in Ahmedabad is that it is actually one of the few standalone reliquary shrine. Many other relics of the Prophet were actually just installed or kept at other kinds of sites. So madrasas were very popular sites where qadams were kept. This is particularly true of Syria and Egypt, where qadams also sort of proliferate. And they would be installed in mosques and in madrasas, right? So the qadam is kind of associated with sites of Islamic ritual and of Islamic learning, right? Learning of the Prophet's traditions. Um, to my understanding, we have other shrines. So, for instance, we have the shrine of the Prophet's mantle, I believe, in Afghanistan. But we don't have a Kadamgah in the sort of what we think of as like the Persianate um, Greater Iranian Plateau, right? Um, it's an interesting thing where it seems that Kadam is more of an Indian Ocean thing. So it's like in the Red Sea, it's in Egypt, it's in kind of like areas that have access to the Red Sea, right? To like Syria. It's in, of course, South Asia, Sri Lanka, but not so much there. Now, I will say that might only be because we don't have there may have been shrines, there may have been relics, but they just didn't develop a kind of like enough of a textual record or an architectural record that we have been able to study, right? So they may have been and we just don't know. Um, Okay, so coming back to South Asia. So in South Asia, many relics of the Prophet are also kept in similar things like madrasas and mosques. So for instance, we have a relic, we have Qadam in the Badshahi Masjid in Lahore, we have it in the Jami Masjid in Delhi. We know that there's a hair shrine in Kashmir, and we know Bengal had a number of these uh, qadams and sort of like those kinds of shrines. Um, Many of these, except for I believe there's one in Bengal, no, sorry, not Bengal. This is at the um, Navina. Do you remember the sheikh that like Shahid Amin's book was on? I'm forgetting. But I feel like so his shrine complex has a site where there's some kind of relic kept, right? So often relics are not kept in like standalone large architectural buildings which are have rituals happening. So even the one in Delhi, sorry, I asked Naveen a question and I cut her off and continued speaking. So that was very rude of me. So even the one in Delhi in the Dargah Kadam Sharif was said to be initially a madrasa that transitions in what its like kind of like function is. So all that to say, there is no singular typology or that the art historians have noted of what a Kadamga would look like. Now, uh, it is 100% true. You look at it and you're like, well, this looks like a Gujarati Jain architecture, right? Like with the pillars and the Chhatri and stuff like that. And so this is actually a very interesting question. My understanding, if I is that Gujarati vernacular architecture, even for Muslim shrines, um, tends to demonstrate this kind of like the shared kind of like architectural idiom that amongst Jain as well. So it might be that we are just what we are seeing in the shrine is a kind of Gujarati vernacular architecture. But I think we just need more art historians to kind of like, the next generation of art historians to sort of think about that. Um, what is notable is this Kadamga is built near a mosque by Abu Turab as well. But this seems to be very much just built for the function of going and circumambulating. This makes me think a little bit of Masjid al-Aqsa in not in terms of its ornamentation, but the fact that there is an ambulatory there with like the Dome of the Rock and sort of the of course that is also a foot relic at that site, and then the mosque part is on the other end of the complex, right? So that could be one sort of a way we could think about at least um, the layout, the spatial layout, but the architectural language is very much Gujarati and very much shared amongst the Jains. And this is what I had two theorems on this. Sorry if I'm rambling on. One
We
is it
have
just that
plenty of time. Yeah.
okay, is it just that which were the craftsmen and stonemasons and stuff who were there in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad and such, what were their existing skills and what was their architectural language, right? So, is it a function of what were being used? Or is it that he wants the site to be legible to an existing architecture? I will say there's another Sayyid family who in the 17th century have two qadams installed at the cenotaph of their sheikh in Ahmedabad. And that shrine, but that one is actually in the a proper shrine, right? So in a very kind of like traditional way, where people go to see the sheikh, and then those two qadams are attached to the cenotaph. Abu Tarab's in both other contexts is also a cenotaph on which the relic is kept, right? So that's a shared practice.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that answer. And yeah, just going back to the earlier response to some of the other relics that were patronized by Sufi or Sufi-inspired rulers, you mentioned
Yeah.
the Durrani one in Kandahar. And I think your research also covers the hair of the Prophet in the Bauchahi Mosque. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so it
Yeah.
seems like reliquary Sufism didn't, of course, completely disappear. But
Yeah.
obviously, there were some other sort of religious trends that sort of maybe mitigated militated against the promotion of that type of Sufism and more scriptural. I wonder, maybe discussing future directions of your research, if you're planning to sort of
Mhm.
investigate in comparative fashion different forms of relics in different contexts, similarities and differences between how these relics were used and understood, and also there's a lot of discussion of the healing powers of a lot of these relics. Is this something that you're
Yes.
planning to sort of investigate a little bit further? And after that, we
Yeah.
can get into another question that was discussed in the Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So, something that when I was writing the dissertation, it was sort of like the thing that I pinged, but I never sort of like fully developed, was that like a lot of times when people talk about both Hadith and relics, they'll use Akbar Asrar, right? Asar, sorry, not Asrar. So the traditions and the traces of the Prophet. And so what, uh, and also like there's some really fabulous new research that's been people have been doing on the category of a trace, the Asar. Um, and so it seems that there's actually a very strong connection between Hadith study and relics, right? On and off. Not that there is intention between those, but they kind of operate together. And in the context of Mughal India, this seems to happen where, like, this relic comes at the same time that you have other people going and bringing hadith back and stuff, right? Where what I see these as are what are the mechanisms that facilitate devotion to the Prophet Muhammad, right? So there are different ways this happens. So what I'm writing with the book is thinking about what are the ways in which textual knowledge about hadith that then gets used to write siras of the Prophet, and then also to write essentially sacred geographies of Medina. Um, how does that operate with, at the same time as you have the movement of manuscripts with illustrations of the Prophet's grave that are brought to India from Mecca? Um, the movement of this relic. So I'm kind of interested in how the movement of books, manuscripts, knowledge, and objects kind of develop a particular or help facilitate a kind of prophetic focused piety. And what I'm sort of like thinking with the context of the book is that rather than seeing these things as tension with each other, not that there isn't one, but rather than seeing them as sort of two, like kind of two approaches where the vein does not meet, there's actually a lot of overlap. So, for instance, when in the ways in which people interact with these relics, the ways in which they interact with the relic is exactly like how the Hadiths say that companions of the Prophet interacted with the Prophet's body.
Mm.
So collecting water that touched his body, collecting that water that came out of his body, like his spit or his sweat, collecting it, using it for healing practices. So all of the practices that you see mentioned with when people would go to relics, in their logic, they map on exactly like how the Hadith say that the Prophet's body was interacted with, right? So that's why I think that, okay, um, maybe some Hadith scholars may not be happy, like Shah Ismail, that the people are venerating relics, but the teachings that he is transmitting share an idea about the Prophet's body that you can see in the way in which people are interacting with the relic. The other thing about actually, and this is an argument that sort of I believe in, is that I don't think that we can think of one standard set of ways in which people interact with relics. It's very much dictated by the material environment in which that relic is kept, right? So,
Mm.
for instance, if you have a hair relic, you can't be dipping it in water. A lot of people can't be teaching it. You have to have it in a box. You can show it to people. If it's preserved in glass vial, maybe some special people can touch it. But when you have a stone kadam, it's different. You can dip it in water. It can be much more showy. People can touch the relic. People can collect the water. And so we have to think about the kind of object that we're talking about. Like for instance, the cloak, the mantle of the prophet. You could only, it's cloth, right? So you can only dip textiles. So you can only dip that in water so many times and then have that water distributed versus stone, right? And
Mm.
it's much safer for pilgrims to come and touch the stone than try to touch that small hair relic, right?
Mm.
So I think that actually the physical shape of the relic and how it is kept and displayed and the architecture that's built around it permits certain kinds of rituals or not, right? So, for instance, when we think about this Kadanga in Ahmedabad or the shrine, the architecture basically forces people to go in a circle. The relic that is kept in the Badshah Masjid is kept in a space that you have to kind of just walk past it.
Mm.
And as you're walking past it, you can like touch it, try to touch it, and I saw somebody trying to do that. But there's no circumambulation. The physicality doesn't permit it, right? So the kind of way you can interact. So I want to kind of also move us away from thinking that there's some kind of like or script of Muslim relic practices, and rather thinking about, okay, how are they kept? What are the histories? Who instituted the rituals? Who built the architecture that forces people in a particular movement? So that's kind of like my approach to it.
Fascinating.
Could just
Very good.
jump in right now. I was just thinking, Usman, just connected
Yes.
to the question that the last question. I'm going to read this out
Yes.
and then put an idea to both of you, Usman and Sajad, ask you to entertain it before we conclude. And so the question is, you mentioned that poetry was also used as a means of evidence for artifacts during tahqiq. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on that and what types of particular works of poetry would have been used. If they were trying
Yeah.
to scriptural use during Tehqiq, how is poetry used differently? And thank you for this very interesting talk. Just to tack question onto the question about poetry and how it's used for Tehqiq, I was just thinking about Pasha Muhammad Khan's argument about asli and nakli forms of verification.
Right. Yeah.
Just in transmission being very, he makes an argument about the differences between literature and history and how porous they are, and how transmission is at the heart of verification in some sense, right? And so if that is something that we think of in the realm of hadith studies, could we think of this circumambulation, the tawaf, and the just touching as you pass by as a way of verifying that if you repeat something enough, it is in some sense. And so
100%. Yeah.
And so I feel like there's this interesting comparison that or connection between hadith and the actual interaction with the relic that, if I've understood your argument correctly, is coming through.
Yeah, no, I'm like excitedly smiling because that's like supports something I've been thinking about, right? Which is that how does tradition sort of like traditions about ritual practice, how are they transmitted? And how does the mere fact of their repetition and transmission, like you say, authorize it for the future, right? And so yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. And to think of that in the context of actually the tradition, the context of the text, I had not actually thought about that, but I really like how you think about that. But yes, I very much agree with you that I think that uh, the fact that, for instance, Akbar ordered that, people perform circumambulations around it when it was like first kept in the tents, then moved outside the mosque. And then when he paid for it, he essentially paid for an ambulatory to be built, right? So I think 100%, and I think this is why we can think about, I think then we can historicize the process, right? Because then we can historicize who are the actors and what are the moments that we can detect in the archive or whatever the archive is of interventions that shape how practice is done. And yeah, you're speaking my language because I think what is really key with this is the actual performance of it has a power. And I feel like Asper Moin kind of makes this point in his book that like, Akbar's kingship is something that was physically embodied and performed, right? And I very much think that yes, in venerating in such an embodied way, right? Like his own kissing of it and carrying it of it on his own shoulders, that action is actually, to go back to your point, it's the most public form of verification, right? Or it's showing the results of verification that he's going to do that. Yeah, no, that was a great thing. And I'll sort of say one thing about the poetry. Yeah, so the poetry that is cited here is actually just poetry that Faizi writes. Now, the way in which poetry works is I don't think that what poetry is doing is that it's not giving some kind of like gotcha proof, but it is often expressing a idea that sort of has a kind of affective power, right? Or sort of, for instance, when one of the poems Faizi says, the Kaaba is made sacred because people perform tawaf. And so why not this Kadamgah that is here, um, you know, it is no less sacred. Then when he's talking about Kadamgah in Delhi, he sort of says, like Delhi is made. Then I can pull out the point to just sort of quote it. And let me just see if I can do that. It won't take me too long. Sorry, forget it. Um, let me just sort of. Yeah. Okay. So one of the like the poems sort of are like this. So it says one of the poems reads, "On the place that bears the impression of the sole of your foot, nishan-e kaf-e paye tu, For many years, it would be the place of prostration, sajda, for those who possess insight. Right? So this is not a poem that is necessarily making some kind of proof, but this is a verse that actually ends up in inscriptions around that site. So you can imagine when people go to the shrine, and if there's somebody who's like reading out the poetry or sort of has access to that, and who's literate and can recite it out, for them this is kind of like would instill a kind of devotional fervor, right? So it's a slightly different thing. And then he says, angels circumambulate about Hazrat Dilli. The Kaaba is sacred on account of the circumambulation, and the Qibla of the soul is the Kaaba for many people of purity. Having been in that place, the foot, so the Qadam is said to have come from Kaaba, right? The foot of the Prophet, circumambulating its sanctuary is suitable for all, especially for the king, because the great Hajj, Hajj Akbar, it's Akbar's Hajj. So what you can see is that the poetry again is not like leading, it's not necessarily poetry that is meant to prove through some sort of fact checking, but I think is to instill a particular kind of emotion or like affect. And she gives it a sort of conceptual framework for thinking about those feelings. So that's what I would sort of say for that. Um,
Thank you so much, Usman and Sajad. I'm so sorry to cut off this conversation. It's just getting going, but we have run out of time. Um, I want to thank everybody for attending today's lecture. We'd love to hear attendee feedback about the session via our 3-minute survey. You can scan the QR code shown on the screen. We'll also be sharing the link. I think it's been shared in the chat, or we can send it by email if you don't have the time to fill it out right now. I want to thank Dr. Hamid and Dr. Nejatieh and this wonderful audience and our team of, our behind the scenes team for making this event possible today. And I urge everyone to please check out our website and our lecture series page to stay updated on our upcoming lectures. And thank you very much.
yeah, thank you so much for organizing this wonderful forum. I feel very privileged to sort of get the chance to present, but then all the feedback was very generous and very generative. Thank you so much.